They told us Texas was where enemies disappeared. The truck rolled across West Texas beneath a sky so large it barely looked real. Dust followed the tires in long red clouds that drifted across the empty road like smoke. Inside the wooden transport bed, 8 German women sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, their gray prison uniforms stiff with dried sweat from the 3-day journey south. No one spoke anymore. They had spoken too much already. About America. About what the guards might do. About the stories they had heard in Europe from officers who promised the Americans were soft until they became cruel. Elsa Schneider sat near the back corner with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the horizon through the slats in the truck wall. She was 27 years old and had once worked as a nurse in a field hospital outside Naples before the front collapsed beneath Allied pressure the previous winter. Since then, she had crossed oceans, train yards, processing camps, and military checkpoints without ever knowing where she would end up next. Louisiana had smelled like wet wood and river mud. Texas smelled different. Dry, hot, endless. The air itself tasted baked. One of the younger women beside her whispered in German, "Do you think this is the camp?" Elsa looked out at the land stretching flat beneath the August heat. Fences cut across the earth for miles. Telephone poles leaned slightly against the wind. Far away, cattle moved like tiny shadows beneath the sun. "No," Elsa said quietly. "This is something else." The truck finally slowed near a wooden ranch gate painted white long ago, but now faded by weather and dust. A windmill turned lazily beside a water tank. Beyond it stood a ranch house with a long porch and a rusted pickup truck parked outside. There were no guard towers, no barbed wire, no searchlights. That frightened the women more than fences would have. The American corporal riding beside the driver climbed down first. He wiped sweat from his forehead and nodded toward the house. "Whitaker Ranch," he said. "Everybody stays calm." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Elsa stepped down carefully from the truck bed, her boots sinking slightly into the red dirt. Heat wrapped around her instantly, thick and suffocating. Somewhere nearby, horses shifted behind a fence line. She heard wind moving through dry grass and the distant creak of metal turning on old hinges. Then she saw him. Thomas Whitaker stood near the porch steps wearing a sweat-darkened work shirt, denim jeans, and a tan hat pushed low against the sun. He looked older than Elsa expected. Early 40s perhaps. Broad shoulders. Sunburned skin. The kind of face shaped more by weather than age. He did not smile when he looked at the prisoners. He simply studied them quietly while holding a pair of leather gloves in one hand. Beside him stood an older woman in a pale cotton dress holding a tray with glasses of water sweating beneath the Texas heat. Elsa stared at the glasses. Real ice floated inside them. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody trusted what they were seeing. Thomas finally stepped forward onto the dirt road. His boots made slow, heavy sounds against the ground. "You girls worked farms before?" he asked plainly. The translator hesitated before repeating the question in German. None of the women answered immediately. Thomas looked at their exhausted faces for another long moment before speaking again. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You'll learn." He pointed toward the ranch house behind him. "You work hard here, you eat well here. Nobody's gonna mistreat you on my property." Elsa heard the words translated softly beside her, but what unsettled her most was not the promise itself. It was the way he said it. Calm, matter of fact, like kindness was simply another ranch rule beneath the Texas sun. The women stood motionless beside the truck while the older woman carried the tray toward them across the yard. The ice cubes inside the glasses clinked softly with each careful step. Elsa could not stop staring at them. Real ice in August. Real glass instead of tin cups. In Germany, hospitals had traded medicines for coal by the final winter of the war. Water had frozen inside broken pipes while cities disappeared under smoke and hunger. Here, beneath a white Texas sky, strangers offered cold lemonade to enemy prisoners like guests. Arriving for supper, the older woman stopped a few feet away and smiled gently beneath the brim of her straw hat. "You poor things look half melted already," she said. The translator repeated the words in German, though the meaning was obvious from her voice alone. She handed the first glass to the youngest prisoner, Anna Bauer, whose trembling hands nearly dropped it from surprise. The woman laughed softly. "Easy now. Plenty more inside." Elsa watched Anna stare suspiciously into the pale yellow drink before taking the smallest sip imaginable. Then another. Her eyes widened instantly. Sugar, lemon, cold water. Anna lowered the glass slowly like she no longer trusted her own senses. It is sweet, she whispered in German. The older woman nodded proudly as if she had understood every word. Clara Whitaker, she said, touching her chest lightly. That is my name. One by one, the women accepted glasses from her hands. Elsa waited until the end. When Clara finally stood before her, Elsa noticed faint flower marks on the woman's sleeves and tiny lines around her eyes carved there by years beneath the sun. She did not look afraid of them. That alone felt strange. Elsa accepted the lemonade carefully. The glass felt shockingly cold against her palm. Condensation slid across her fingers. For a moment, she simply stood there holding it. Thomas Whitaker watched from beside the porch rail, silent beneath his hat, while the wind pushed dust across the yard between them. Go on, Clara said gently. Drink before the ice disappears. Elsa lifted the glass slowly to her lips. The first swallow stopped her breath. Cold sweetness spread across her tongue, so suddenly it almost hurt. Real lemons. Real sugar. She closed her eyes before she could stop herself. Around her, nobody spoke anymore. The only sounds came from windmills turning in the distance and cattle lowing somewhere beyond the fence line. Elsa had forgotten drinks could taste like summer instead of survival. Clara studied their faces quietly, understanding more than the translator could explain. Thomas, she said over her shoulder, they need food before they fall over. Thomas nodded once toward the house. Kitchens. Inside. Wash up first. The women hesitated. Entering an American home still felt dangerous somehow, like crossing an invisible line that could disappear beneath them at any moment. Elsa noticed Thomas watching their uncertainty. Nobody here is trying to trick you, he said plainly. You are workers, not animals. The translator repeated the sentence softly. Elsa looked down at the lemonade trembling slightly in her hands. Workers, not animals. The words settled strangely inside her chest because they should not have mattered so much. Clara led them toward a water pump beside the porch where clean towels hung drying in the heat. Anna froze when she saw the white cloths. These are for us? She asked quietly. Clara blinked in confusion before understanding the question through tone alone. Of course they are, she answered. Elsa washed her hands beneath cool well water while dust spiraled around her boots. She looked toward the open kitchen window and smelled fresh bread, roasted beef, onions cooking slowly in butter. Her stomach tightened painfully at the scent. Thomas stood nearby repairing a fence hinge with slow practiced movements. He glanced toward Elsa without lifting his head fully. You were a nurse? He asked. Elsa stiffened immediately. How do you know that? She replied after the translator spoke. Thomas pointed toward her hands. You scrub like one. For the first time since arriving in America, Elsa did not know what to say. Elsa lowered her hands slowly beneath the stream of cool water while Thomas returned to the broken fence hinge without another word. The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than suspicion would have. In Europe, soldiers asked questions to gain control. Officers asked questions to remind people who held power. But the rancher spoke the way a man commented on weather or cattle prices, noticing details because details mattered. Clara pushed open the kitchen screen door with her elbow and called everyone inside before the heat spoiled supper. The women stepped cautiously across the wooden porch. Their boots sounded hollow against the boards. Elsa smelled coffee first, then fresh bread, onions, roasted meat, and something sweet cooling near the window. The kitchen itself looked brighter than any room she had seen in months. White curtains moved softly above the sink where afternoon sunlight spilled across polished counters. Copper pans hung beside shelves lined with jars of peaches, beans, flour, and preserves. Nothing matched the America described in wartime newspapers. Nothing matched the stories whispered through prison camps at night. Clara pointed toward the long wooden table. Sit wherever you like. The women hesitated again. Anna finally chose the chair nearest the door as if escape still mattered. Elsa sat farther down near the window where warm wind drifted through the screen, carrying the scent of dry grass outside. Clara began placing bowls across the table one by one. Mashed potatoes covered in brown gravy. Green beans cooked with bacon. Thick slices of roast beef resting beside homemade bread still steaming slightly from the oven. The women stared in complete silence. Elsa noticed one prisoner quietly crossing herself beneath the table before touching her fork. Thomas entered last after washing his hands outside. He removed his hat near the doorway and sat across from Elsa without ceremony. "You ladies know how to pray?" Clara asked gently. Several women exchanged nervous looks. Elsa answered carefully. "Some of us do." Clara nodded once. "Then that is enough." Everyone lowered their heads while Clara thanked God for rain, work, food, and safe arrivals. Elsa did not pray. She simply listened to the strange calm inside the room. No shouting. No propaganda speeches crackling through loudspeakers. No boots echoing down hospital corridors. Only the ticking clock above the stove and wind brushing against the house. When the prayer ended, Clara smiled softly. "Now eat before it gets cold." At first, the women moved cautiously, taking small portions as if large servings might be taken away. But hunger always defeated caution eventually. Forks began moving faster. Bread disappeared. Clara refilled plates before anyone asked. Anna nearly cried after tasting the potatoes. Another woman laughed suddenly at herself for eating too quickly. The sound startled everyone because none of them had heard genuine laughter in so long. Thomas ate quietly while watching the women from beneath tired eyes. He did not stare at them like prisoners. He observed them the way a rancher studied weather patterns or injured horses, calm and patient. Elsa noticed him glance toward her untouched coffee cup. "You do not drink coffee?" he asked. "Not since Italy," Elsa replied softly. "It stopped tasting like coffee there." Thomas looked at the dark liquid in his own cup for a second before nodding slowly. "Well," he said, "Clara burns this batch fresh every Thursday morning. Tastes strong enough to wake the dead." Clara rolled her eyes without anger. "Thomas Whitaker, do not say things like that at supper." For the first time, Elsa smiled before she remembered not to. It was small, barely visible, but Thomas noticed it immediately. Later, while Clara sliced peach pie near the stove, a sharp crashing sound exploded outside from the direction of the horse barn. One of the ranch hands shouted something across the yard. Thomas stood instantly, chair scraping backward against the floor. The easy warmth vanished from his face in a second. He grabbed his hat from the table and headed for the door. "Stay here," he said automatically. But Elsa was already listening to the panic in the voices outside, and years spent in field hospitals had trained her ears faster than thought. Somebody was hurt. The shouting outside carried the sharp edge of fear that Elsa recognized instantly. She pushed back her chair before anyone else moved. Thomas was already halfway across the porch when she stepped through the screen door behind him. Hot evening wind rushed across the yard carrying dust and the smell of hay from the barn. One of the ranch hands stood near the corral waving frantically. A young horse kicked against the wooden rail while another man knelt in the dirt clutching his arm. "Easy now," Thomas shouted toward the frightened animal as he crossed the yard at a run. The ranch hand on the ground looked barely 20. Sweat covered his face beneath the fading sunlight. Elsa followed without thinking, her instincts moving ahead of caution. Years earlier in Italy, wounded soldiers had arrived by truck every night beneath the same kind of urgent voices and hurried footsteps. Fear always sounded the same in every language. Thomas reached the injured ranch hand first and crouched beside him. "Billy, let me see it." The young man grimaced through clenched teeth while dust blew across his boots. His forearm bent awkwardly near the wrist where swelling had already begun beneath the skin. Elsa stopped several feet away automatically, uncertain whether she was allowed closer. One of the other ranch hands noticed her prison uniform immediately and frowned. "What is she doing out here?" he asked sharply. Thomas did not even look up. "Standing," he answered flatly. Billy tried to laugh through the pain, but failed halfway. "Horse spooked," he muttered. Gate chain snapped loose. Thomas examined the arm carefully without touching it much. He looked toward the house as if calculating distance and time at once. The nearest doctor lived nearly 30 miles away in Abilene. Night was already settling across the ranch. Elsa studied the angle of the wrist from where she stood. Not shattered, not bleeding heavily, but wrong enough to matter. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides. Then Billy shifted again and gasped from the movement. Elsa stepped forward before she could reconsider. "Do not let him move the arm anymore," she said quietly. Every face turned toward her. Wind creaked through the corral fence. One of the ranch hands crossed his arms immediately. "She a doctor now?" Elsa ignored the comment. She had heard worse from frightened men in field hospitals. Thomas finally looked up at her directly beneath the brim of his hat. You know injuries? He asked. I know pain, Elsa answered. The silence stretched for one long second before Thomas nodded once toward Billy. Go ahead then. Elsa knelt carefully in the dirt beside the young ranch hand. Billy looked nervous at first, more confused than afraid, but Elsa's voice remained calm, and even while she examined the swollen wrist with practiced fingers. You fell against the gate? She asked softly. Billy nodded. Horse knocked me sideways. Elsa looked toward Thomas. Not broken. Completely, she said. But if he keeps moving it, it may become worse. Thomas listened without interrupting. Elsa glanced toward the barn. I need 2 pieces of flatwood. About this long. She measured quickly with her hands. One of the ranch workers hesitated before Thomas gave him a short look. You heard her. The man disappeared toward the tack room without another word. Elsa loosened Billy's sleeve carefully while speaking low enough to steady him more than inform him. You are lucky. Horses are stronger than walls. Billy actually laughed weakly at that. Dust moved across the yard in soft red waves while evening shadows stretched longer beside the fences. Clara appeared on the porch holding clean towels against her chest, watching silently from a distance. Elsa wrapped the injured arm gently once the wooden splints arrived. Her movements stayed efficient and precise, neither hurried nor dramatic. Years of hospital work returned to her hands as naturally as breathing. When she finally finished securing the makeshift brace with strips torn from an old flour sack, Billy flexed his fingers carefully in surprise. Hurts less, he admitted quietly. Elsa sat back on her heels, brushing dust from her palms. Thomas studied the splint for a long moment before lifting his eyes toward her again. Where did you learn that? Elsa looked toward the darkening horizon beyond the ranch fences. In places that no longer exist, she said softly. Darkness settled slowly across Whitaker Ranch, while heat still rose from the ground in soft waves. Lantern light flickered inside the barn as Billy rested on an overturned feed bucket with his injured arm secured against his chest. The other ranch hands had stopped arguing once they saw the swelling begin to settle beneath Elsa's splint. Even the man who questioned her earlier now stood quietly near the corral fence, chewing tobacco without meeting her eyes. Thomas remained beside the gate studying the repaired chain with slow, deliberate movements. Elsa washed dust from her hands at the water pump while cold well water splashed across her wrists. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The ranch seemed suspended in the strange silence that follows a storm which never fully arrives. Then Billy cleared his throat awkwardly. Ma'am, he said toward Elsa. I appreciate the help. Elsa looked up from the pump handle. The word surprised her more than the gratitude itself. Ma'am, not prisoner, not German, not enemy, just a woman standing beneath the Texas night with wet hands and tired eyes. She nodded once. You should keep the arm elevated while you sleep, she replied softly. Billy laughed weakly. You sound exactly like Doc Patterson. Thomas finally closed the gate chain with a metallic click and walked back toward the house carrying his gloves in one hand. Doc Patterson charges $5 to say the same thing, he muttered. A few of the men chuckled quietly. The tension in the yard loosened at last. Clara stepped down from the porch holding a fresh pot of coffee and several clean cups balanced carefully on a tray. If we are all done nearly frightening each other to death, she announced, then somebody better drink this coffee before it turns bitter. The ranch hands gathered automatically near the porch steps while moths circled the lantern above the door. Elsa stayed near the edge of the yard beside the pump, uncertain whether the invitation included her. Thomas noticed immediately. He poured coffee into a white enamel cup and crossed the dirt toward her without hurry. Here, he said simply. Elsa stared at the cup before taking it carefully. The coffee smelled strong and smoky beneath the cool desert wind beginning to roll across the fields. Thomas leaned one shoulder against the fence beside her. Billy will be fine, he said after a moment. Probably complains more than the injury deserves. Elsa wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Most men do. Thomas looked sideways at her then, surprised by the dry humor hidden beneath her quiet voice. For the first time, she saw something close to amusement touch the corners of his tired face. It vanished quickly, but not before she noticed. Across the yard, the other women prisoners stood near the porch watching cautiously while Clara passed around slices of peach pie wrapped in cloth napkins. Anna smiled openly now, speaking broken English, with one of the younger ranch workers who attempted broken German in return. Their words barely connected, but somehow the laughter did. Elsa watched the scene in disbelief. Only that morning they had arrived, convinced Americans viewed them as dangerous animals from a defeated nation. Now ranch hands shared pie and coffee beneath a Texas sky wide enough to swallow every speech and slogan Europe ever produced. Thomas sipped quietly from his own cup, while coyotes called somewhere beyond the dark pasture fences. "You know," he said eventually, "Captain Hayes told me your group would probably keep to yourselves a while." Elsa looked toward the porch where Anna accepted a second slice of pie from Clara with embarrassed gratitude. "We thought Americans hated us." Thomas considered that for a second. "Some do," he admitted honestly. "War leaves people carrying things they do not know where to put anymore." Elsa lowered her eyes toward the coffee rippling gently inside the cup. "In Germany, they told us Americans were cruel." Thomas rested his elbows against the fence rail. Wind moved softly through the dry grass around them. "And what do you think now?" he asked. Elsa did not answer immediately. She looked at the ranch house glowing warm against the darkness, at Clara laughing softly on the porch, at Billy lifting his bandaged arm proudly while the others teased him, at the lantern light reflecting off enamel cups and dusty boots. Then she spoke so quietly Thomas almost missed it. "I think," she said, "nobody told us the truth about ordinary people." The next morning arrived with pale gold sunlight spreading slowly across the ranch house windows. Elsa woke before dawn out of old habit, her body still trained by years of hospital shifts and military schedules. For a moment she forgot where she was. The room smelled unfamiliar. Clean cotton sheets, soap, dry cedar wood warmed by Texas heat. Then she heard cattle lowing somewhere beyond the fields and remembered the ranch, the porch lanterns, the coffee, and Clara Whitaker laughing softly beneath the stars. Elsa sat up slowly on the narrow bed inside the bunkhouse prepared for the women prisoners. Around her, the others still slept beneath thin blankets while early wind rattled the screen windows gently. She dressed quietly and stepped outside before the sun climbed fully over the horizon. Morning air carried a brief coolness that would disappear within the hour. Dew clung to patches of grass near the water troughs while horses shifted lazily in their pens. Elsa stood still beside the fence line watching Texas wake itself piece by piece. In Europe, mornings during the war often arrived with sirens, engines, smoke, or fear already waiting at the door. Here, the loudest sound came from an old windmill turning against the breeze. Most people sleep later their first day here. Elsa turned at the voice. Thomas stood near the barn carrying 2 metal buckets, his hat pushed back slightly against the morning light. "I could not sleep," Elsa admitted. Thomas nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. "Coffee is already on." She followed him toward the ranch house kitchen, where Clara moved between the stove and counter wearing a blue apron dusted with flour. Bacon crackled in a cast-iron skillet while biscuits baked inside the oven. Clara looked up and smiled immediately. "Good. Somebody sensible is awake before these ranch hands eat everything." Elsa still was not used to being spoken to with warmth. Clara handed her a coffee cup automatically, no hesitation anymore. "You take cream?" Elsa shook her head lightly. "Black is fine." Thomas glanced sideways at her while pouring oats into a feed sack near the back door. "Now you sound American already." Elsa almost smiled into the coffee. Outside, the ranch slowly filled with movement as workers emerged from bunkhouses and barns beneath the rising heat. Billy arrived last with his splinted arm hanging carefully in a cloth sling. "Doc, Elsa saved me from hard labor," he announced dramatically. Clara snorted softly. That arm was never connected to hard labor in the first place. Laughter spread around the kitchen table while Billy pretended to look offended. Elsa watched the exchange quietly, uncertain why the ordinary rhythm of breakfast unsettled her so deeply. Plates passed from hand to hand. Biscuits disappeared beneath butter and honey. Someone complained about weather forecasts from Abilene. Someone else argued about baseball scores over the radio. It all felt impossibly normal. Thomas finally stood from the table and looked toward the women prisoners gathered near the doorway. "Work assignments," he said simply. "Nothing too difficult today. Heat is already climbing." He pointed toward different areas of the ranch one by one. 2 women would help Clara with laundry and preserving vegetables. Another pair would clean tack equipment in the barn. Anna would assist feeding chickens. Then Thomas looked toward Elsa. "You know animals?" Elsa hesitated. Only enough to keep soldiers from riding sick horses. Thomas considered that answer for half a second. Good enough. He motioned toward the far pasture outside the window where several calves moved slowly near a water trough. One of the young calves has been limping since yesterday. I was planning to look at it after breakfast. Elsa lowered her coffee cup carefully onto the table. And you want the German prisoner to help? She asked quietly. Thomas rested one hand against the back of his chair. No, he replied. I want the nurse. The room fell silent for just a moment. Not tense silence. Something softer. Clara looked down at her coffee with the faintest smile hidden near the edge of her cup, while morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen floorboards between them. The calf stood beneath a patch of cottonwood shade near the south pasture fence, flicking its tail weakly against flies while the morning heat climbed higher across the ranch. Elsa walked beside Thomas through knee-high grass still damp from dawn. He carried a dented metal bucket filled with water while she held a folded towel and a small canvas medical pouch Clara had somehow assembled from old ranch supplies. The calf limped badly when it shifted weight onto its front leg. Stepped into barbed wire yesterday, Thomas explained quietly. Cut healed crooked overnight. Elsa crouched slowly beside the animal while the calf watched her with wide, uncertain eyes. She noticed immediately how carefully Thomas stayed still nearby, giving her space instead of instructions. Most men she had worked beside during the war believed helping meant taking control. Thomas Whitaker simply observed and listened. Elsa touched the calf gently along the injured leg while dust swirled around their boots. The cut itself looked shallow but irritated from dirt and heat. It is frightened more than injured, she said softly. Thomas rested his forearms against the fence rail. Sounds familiar. Elsa glanced at him briefly before returning to the calf. She cleaned the wound carefully with cool water while the animal trembled beneath her hands. The Texas sun climbed brighter overhead, turning the pasture gold beneath waves of heat. Somewhere far off, a truck engine echoed along the county road. Elsa wrapped the calf's leg with strips of clean cloth torn from an old feed sack. Her movements remained steady and efficient, but inside she still felt the strange disbelief that had followed her since arriving at the ranch. Nobody shouted at her. Nobody treated her like a threat waiting to happen. Thomas watched quietly while she worked. You miss Germany? He asked after a long silence. Elsa paused for only a second. Which Germany? Thomas considered that answer without smiling. Fair point. Elsa tied the final knot carefully before standing again. The calf tested its weight more confidently this time. Thomas nodded once toward the animal. You are good at calming things down. Elsa wiped dust from her hands. Not always. Before Thomas could answer, the sound of another vehicle approached from the main road beyond the pasture. Both of them turned toward the rising cloud of dirt drifting across the fields. A dark green army jeep bounced through the ranch gate several seconds later. Elsa felt her stomach tighten instantly at the sight of military paint beneath the Texas sun. Thomas pushed away from the fence slowly. That will be Captain Hayes, he muttered. The jeep stopped hard near the barn, sending dust rolling across the yard. Captain Robert Hayes stepped out wearing a pressed uniform despite the heat, his jaw already tense before speaking a single word. Two younger soldiers remained inside the vehicle while Hayes scanned the ranch with sharp military eyes. Clara appeared on the porch wiping flour from her hands with a kitchen towel. The other German women froze near the clothesline behind the bunkhouse. Elsa noticed fear return to their posture immediately, as if uniforms alone could drag them backward into old realities. Thomas removed his hat slowly and walked toward the jeep. Elsa followed several yards behind without meaning to. Morning, Captain, Thomas said evenly. Hayes nodded once, but did not return the calm tone. Got complaints from town, he replied. People talking about prisoners wandering around like house guests instead of detainees. Thomas crossed his arms. They are working. They are sitting on porches drinking coffee with civilians. Hayes glanced toward the women near the clothesline before his eyes landed briefly on Elsa. One rancher says you let a German prisoner treat an injured worker last night. Thomas did not flinch. She helped Billy before his arm turned worse. Hayes exhaled sharply through his nose. That is not the point. The morning air suddenly felt hotter around them. Elsa watched Thomas carefully because she realized something now for the first time. The ranch had protected them from fear for exactly one night. Outside the fences, the war was still waiting. Captain Hayes removed his gloves slowly while heat shimmered above the ranch yard like invisible fire. Dust drifted around the parked Jeep in thin red waves. Elsa stood several feet behind Thomas near the fence line, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to remember exactly who she was in the eyes of the army. A prisoner. Temporary labor. Someone assigned a number before arriving at Whitaker Ranch. Hayes glanced around the property with growing irritation. The women near the clothesline lowered their eyes immediately beneath his stare. "These arrangements are becoming too relaxed," he said sharply. "People in town are talking." Thomas remained calm beside the Jeep. People in town always talk. Not when enemy prisoners are eating supper at civilian tables. Hayes pointed toward the ranch house porch where empty coffee cups still rested beside Clara's pie plates from breakfast. "This is not a social program." "Whitaker." Clara stepped down from the porch before Thomas could answer. "No," she said evenly. "It is called feeding human beings." Hayes sighed heavily, clearly exhausted before the argument even began. "Mrs. Whitaker, with respect, the country is at war." Clara folded the kitchen towel neatly over one arm. "That is exactly why decent behavior matters." For a moment, nobody spoke. Elsa watched Hayes carefully. Unlike Thomas, the captain carried war visibly in the way he stood, tight through the shoulders, permanently alert, like rest itself had become dangerous. His eyes landed on Elsa again. "You are Schneider, correct?" Elsa straightened automatically. "Yes, Captain." "Former field nurse?" "Yes." Hayes nodded once. "Billy Turner says you treated his arm properly last night." Elsa remained silent because she could not tell whether this was accusation or acknowledgement. Hayes looked toward Thomas again. "That still does not change regulations." Before Thomas could respond, another vehicle appeared at the ranch gate behind the Jeep, moving too fast across the dirt road. A dusty pickup truck bounced violently through the entrance before skidding to a stop near the barn. A man jumped out immediately, panic already written across his face. "Tom," he shouted breathlessly, "I need help." Thomas stepped forward at once. "What happened?" "It is Danny," the man said, struggling to catch his breath. "He collapsed out near the Miller property. High fever. Barely breathing right." Fear spread across the yard instantly. Clara lowered her hand against her chest. One of the ranch workers muttered softly under his breath. The man looked desperately between Thomas and Captain Hayes. "Doc Patterson is halfway to Abilene. Nobody can reach him." Then his eyes suddenly landed on Elsa standing near the fence. Recognition flashed across his face. "That is the German nurse Billy told us about?" Hayes immediately stiffened. "Absolutely not." But the desperate father barely heard him anymore. "My boy is 12 years old," he said, voice cracking beneath the Texas heat. "I do not care where she came from if she knows how to help." Silence crashed across the ranch yard. Elsa felt every pair of eyes turned toward her at once. Hayes stepped closer instantly. "She is a prisoner under Army supervision." Thomas looked toward the frightened father whose hands still trembled beside the truck door. "How long has the fever been climbing?" "Since last night," the man answered. "He cannot keep water down." Elsa's hospital instincts moved faster than fear again. Severe dehydration in August heat could destroy a child quickly. She stepped forward carefully. "How old is he?" she asked. 12, the father repeated. "Name is Danny." Hayes turned sharply toward Elsa. "You stay here." But the father suddenly removed his hat with shaking hands. "Not to the captain. To her." "Please," he whispered. The words settled heavily across the dust and silence. Elsa looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Hayes. The captain rubbed one exhausted hand across his forehead beneath the brutal Texas sun, as if the war itself had somehow followed him into this exact moment. Then Thomas spoke quietly. "Captain," he said, "sometimes regulations and reality are not the same thing." Hayes stared at the ranch house, the frightened father, the waiting Jeep, the German nurse standing silently in prison clothes beneath a white Texas sky. Finally, he exhaled slowly through his nose. "1 hour," he muttered. "And Whitaker, if this turns into a problem, it becomes your problem." Thomas nodded once. "Fair enough." Elsa moved toward the pickup truck without another word while the father opened the passenger door for her with trembling hands. For the second time since arriving in Texas, somebody was trusting the enemy with the thing they loved most. The Miller house sat alone beneath the open Texas sky nearly 5 miles from Whitaker Ranch, surrounded by dry pastureland and a sagging white fence weathered pale by years of sun. Dust followed the pickup truck all the way up the narrow dirt road, while Elsa held tightly to the dashboard beside Danny Miller's father. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. Fear had already taken up too much room inside the cab. When they reached the farmhouse, a woman rushed onto the porch before the truck fully stopped. Her face looked exhausted from crying and worry. "James," she called toward her husband. "He is getting worse." Then she saw Elsa climbing from the passenger side in a faded prison uniform and froze completely. The silence lasted only a second. "She is the nurse," James said quickly. "She came to help." The woman looked uncertain, frightened, and desperate all at once. Finally, she stepped aside from the doorway. "Upstairs," she whispered. "Please." Elsa climbed the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time, while afternoon heat pressed heavily against the farmhouse walls. The boy lay beneath damp blankets near an open window where weak wind barely stirred the curtains. His cheeks were flushed deep red from fever. A bowl of untouched water sat beside the bed. Elsa moved quietly to his side and placed the back of her hand against his forehead. Burning hot. His breathing remained shallow but steady. "How long since he drank water?" she asked softly. "Since early morning," Danny's mother answered from the doorway. Elsa nodded once while examining the boy carefully. "Bring cool cloths. Not cold. And fresh water with salt and sugar if you have it." The woman hurried downstairs immediately, relieved simply to receive instructions from someone calm. Elsa sat beside the bed, adjusting the pillows slightly to ease the child's breathing. Danny opened his eyes weakly after several moments. "Mama," he whispered. "She is here," Elsa replied gently. "You are safe." The boy looked at her strange accent and prison uniform with confusion clouded by fever. "You German?" Elsa paused briefly before answering. "Yes." Danny stared at the ceiling for a second. "My brother fights Germans." Elsa lowered the cloth into cool water slowly. "I know." The boy studied her face again with the blunt honesty only children possessed. "You do not look scary." Something inside Elsa tightened unexpectedly at the words. She wrung out the cloth carefully before placing it across his forehead. "Most people do not," she said quietly. Hours passed slowly beneath the endless Texas afternoon. Elsa cooled the fever, kept Danny drinking small amounts of water, and watched his breathing settle little by little as the worst heat began fading from the room. His mother stayed nearby the entire time, twisting a handkerchief nervously in her lap, while James paced downstairs beneath creaking floorboards. By sunset, Danny finally managed a few bites of bread without becoming sick again. Relief swept visibly across the farmhouse like fresh rain after drought. Outside, the sound of another vehicle approached across the dirt road. Dr. Patterson had finally arrived from Abilene. The older physician climbed the porch steps carrying a worn leather medical case and looking irritated from the long drive until Elsa opened the bedroom door upstairs. He stopped immediately. "Well," he muttered, removing his glasses in surprise. "Either I took a wrong turn somewhere or the army has become considerably more efficient." Danny's mother laughed for the first time all day through exhausted tears. Dr. Patterson examined the boy carefully before nodding in approval toward Elsa's work. "You likely kept this fever from turning dangerous," he admitted quietly once they stepped into the hallway. Elsa lowered her eyes automatically. Praise still felt unfamiliar after so many years surviving war by becoming invisible. Downstairs, James Miller stood waiting near the front door with his hat clutched tightly in both hands. Evening light spilled gold across the farmhouse porch behind him. "Miss Schneider," he said carefully, "I judged you before I met you." Elsa said nothing. James swallowed hard once before continuing. "Today my son is breathing easier because you walked through my front door anyway." Outside, another truck waited near the fence line. Thomas Whitaker leaned quietly against the driver's side beside Captain Hayes, who looked tired enough to surrender the entire argument to the sunset itself. Elsa stepped onto the porch while warm wind rolled across the fields carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Captain Hayes studied her for one long moment before speaking. "You done here, nurse?" Elsa looked back toward the farmhouse window where Danny now slept peacefully beneath fading evening light. Then she nodded softly. Hayes opened the passenger door without another word. As the truck rolled slowly back toward Whitaker Ranch. Beneath the enormous Texas sky, Elsa realized something she would carry long after the war disappeared into history. The Americans had not changed her life with speeches, victories, or power. They changed it with coffee poured into steady hands, doors left open without fear, and the quiet decision to see a prisoner as a human being first. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.